Everyone, this is Elana Stein Hain, and I'm sharing my remarks from the Siyum that we had in Yerushalayim in Amy Cohen's home on Batra, where I also had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Karen Kirschenbaum teach. It was so inspiring to be at an in-person Siyum. I hope people were inspired by their Siyumim wherever they were. What I want to do, and this is why there's weird architecture behind me, is I want to think a little bit bigger than my last dinanddaf share. My last dinanddaf share was about the structure of the Mishnayot in Batra, kind of a superstructure, the ideational superstructure, where I suggested that Batra is actually about different relationships and different prakim focus on different relationships. And you can see that through the Mishnayot. Here I want to focus on the superstructure of all the Bavot, specifically by looking at the bookends of each of the Bavot in Mishnah. So I want to look at the first and last Mishnah in Bava Kama, first and last Mishnah in Bava Metzia, first and last Mishnah in Bava Batra. The reason why I want to do this is because I think Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra are moving us in an ideational direction, giving us different ways of thinking about the possibility of possessions and people and relationships in big ways. And then I also think because Bava Kama and Bava Metzia and Bava Batra are really originally one Masechet, it's worth seeing both the bookends, beginning of Bava Kama, end of Bava Batra, and also the seams throughout. The last Mishnah in Bava Kama, how does it connect to the first Mishnah in Bava Metzia? Last Mishnah in Bava Metzia, how does it connect to the first Mishnah in Bava Batra? It's just seeing how this all kinds of works together. So what are the big ideas that are being communicated in each of these Bavot, or at least being framed as the big ideas, beginning and end in each of these Bavot? And then ultimately, how does this all relate to Masechet Sanhedrin? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and start with the fact that I was reading something that Rabbi Dr. Avi Wolfish wrote about the last Mishnah in Bava Batra and its relationship to the first Mishnah in Bava Kama, that I thought was really interesting. And then I realized that I wanted to build on it and move further with it. Okay. So I just want to fix the way that you can view this source sheet. Let's go to read mode. Yep. That's what we want it to look like. Okay. So the last Mishnah in Bava Batra, Perek Yud Mishnah Chet, should sound familiar for those who just learned it. So if you give a halva, you give a loan to somebody. If you used a contract, then the creditor can collect even from property that has been sold since the time of the halva by the debtor. But if you only did it through witnesses, meaning there was no contract, then you cannot collect the debt from property that has been sold since that time. Okay? Since the time of the loan. You can only collect property that is in the domain of the debtor right now. Similarly, if what you have is kind of a note that was signed by the debtor that he owes something, but we're not talking about a contract per se, then also only property that hasn't been sold and is still in the domain of the debtor can you collect from. Fine, that's sort of part one. Part two, Ariv Hayotze La'achar Chitum Shtarot Govei Menichasim B'nei Chorin. Also on the question of when are you allowed to collect from property that has been sold since the time of the loan versus when are you only allowed to collect from property that's still in the domain of the person who's going to pay? Similar question with an Ariv with a guarantor. So if the guarantor's name is actually underneath the name of the Eidim, the names of the Eidim on the contract, when you're collecting from the guarantor, you can only collect from the property that the guarantor has in their domain now, not from things they have sold. And this actually happened, and Rabbi Yishmael says, yep, only the property that the guarantor has now. You can't go to those who have bought property from them since the time of the loan and collect from them. And Amar lo Benana says, actually, to be honest, I think you are allowing too much. You shouldn't be allowed to collect from any of the Arev's property if the Arev's name came after the Eidim on the shtar. Amar lo lama, he says, why not? Amar lo, he says, Amar lo hanach lo. If somebody saw two people fighting in the shuk, one person saying, I'm throttling you because I want you to give me my money that you owe me, and a third party, that person comes over and says, oh, stop throttling that person, I'll pay you. Patur, that third party doesn't have to pay. The halva wasn't made in the first place on the basis of, oh, I trust that this Ariv is going to pay back. And the same problem if the Ariv's name shows up after the signatures. It has to be that the halva was given on the basis of the inclusion of the Ariv's possibility to pay back. Now, interesting little sidebar. My husband and I, we both signed our ketubah after the Eidim, of course, so that it wouldn't be part of the shtar per se, but it was our way of sort of personalizing the ketubah in a sense, right? Our names were not part of the shtar itself. It was just sort of afterwards. There's a similar problem if the Ariv tries to do the same thing, right? Then we have part 3. Then we finish up. Who is a guarantor who has to pay? Only a case of halveu v'ani noten lecha. I'm, the Ariv says to the creditor, give a loan and I will pay you back. Chayav, then they are responsible. The Ariv is responsible. Shekena elamanotel helvahu, right? The halva'a was done on the basis of the trust in the Ariv. And then part 3, Amar Rabbi Yishmael, harotzeh she'achkim yasok b'dinei mamonot. If you want to become wise, you should learn dinei mamonot, the laws of finance, halachic laws of finance. She'en lecha miktzah b'torah gadol mehen. There's nothing more comprehensive than that. She'en kemayan hanovea. They're like a spring that is bursting forth. V'harotzeh she'asok b'dinei mamonot. And if you want to learn this tchum, this arena, yishamesh et Shimon ben Nanas. You should be learning from Shimon ben Nanas, right? He was impressed by ben Nanas's understanding. So this whole business in this Mishnah has sort of 2 aspects to it. One is this big question about nechasim b'nei charein versus nechasim mishubadim, and another is this role of the Ariv and how it's defined. So what Wallfish noted, and I thought this was really interesting, he says, I feel that this is, in a way, an inverse of the conversation at the beginning of Bava Kama. What's the conversation at the beginning of Bava Kama? Let's take ourselves back there, both in our minds and literally on this page. The opening Mishnah of Bava Kama is Arba'a Avot Nizikin. There are 4 categories of damages. Ashor, V'habor, V'hamav'eh, V'haev'er. Right? You've got the ox, you've got the pit, you've got mav'eh, which maybe it's the tooth of an animal, or maybe it's a person, right? And you've got hev-er, you've got fire. He says what's interesting is the way that Bava Kama starts is your possessions get you in trouble. Your possessions don't help you. They do damage, and then you're on the hook. The way that Bava Batra ends is your land, maybe even sometimes land that you sold, is actually a type of guarantor for you, right? Your possessions help you even if you sold them. Just different relationship to possessions. I thought that was kind of interesting. I actually thought that was very interesting to consider. And then I realized I actually see a couple more relationships here. Another possible relationship, I think, is simply that the end of the Mishnah in Bava Kama is actually about that if you are obligated to pay damages, you have to pay b'meitav haaretz. You actually have to pay, if you're paying with land, you have to pay with the best land, you have to pay with Edi. So the connection between paying with land to repay your debt, paying with land to pay damages, I think is already here, which makes perfect sense. All these things are going to be financial. But the most interesting thing to my mind is actually, I think, what the beginning Mishnah and the end Mishnah, the beginning of Bava Kama and the end of Bava Batra actually have in common in a really fascinating way is the sort of threat of violence to humans that's lurking in the background, right? When we talk about a shore, right? Yes, we might be talking about a shore that is breaking stuff, but what's in the background, and it's going to come up in the Mishnayot, is a shore that's goring a person, right? That's killing a person. And similarly, at the last Mishnah in Bava Batra, we seem to be talking about a financial transaction of you gave me a halva, you gave me a loan, But look at what it's coming to. It's coming to somebody throttling the other person. So that threat of violence is sort of always in the background there, meaning that threat of violence towards humans is always in the background. I find that really interesting. So that's number one, possibility of finding a relationship between how you look at your land or your possessions. At the beginning of Bava Kama, it gets you into trouble. At the end of Bava Batra, it actually helps you, right? At the beginning of Bava Kama, you're using your land to pay off damages. At the end of Bava Batra, you're using your land to pay off a debt, right? At the beginning of Bava Kama, we see violence against human lurking in the background, and it's going to come up in the Mishnayot eventually. And the end of Bava Batra, we see violence also lurking as a possibility. But now I want to look at each of the Bavot on their own, the first and last Mishnah, and take a look at what do we think each of these Bavot, at least in their framings, is giving us in terms of the questions of possession and what it means in Halakha and what we should be thinking about. So the first thing we know in Bava Kama is the big conversation as to what is the basis of the Isur Lahazik, right? What is the basis of the prohibition to do damage to another person's property? Because it doesn't seem like it's being connected to an Isser in the Torah. People say it's lo tigzol, right? That you shouldn't steal. So what's fascinating about this is Bava Kama starts with a very clear understanding of what belongs to me and what belongs to you. What's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. If yours damages mine, you have to pay. It's very, very clear. And likewise, the Mishnah at the end of Bava Kama also ends with this clarity of what belongs to me and what belongs to you. Let's make sure that you're not gozelet. Make sure that you're not going to steal. So what's the example at the end of Bava Kama? Mochin shehakoves mutzi hare elu shelo. If a launderer is doing laundry and pulls out some strands of wool, it belongs to the launderer. We assume that the person who owns it doesn't care if a few strands are pulled out. But vashasorek motzi, but somebody who's preparing the wool as a textile, right? If they take out strands, hare elu shel balabait. That belongs to the person who gave them the cloth to begin with. Likely, we're talking about they take out more strands, and that's right. Also, imaya shachor al gabi lavan, if this was black strands on something white and they took it, notel etzakol vein shelo, the person can take whatever they want. I clearly skipped I skipped a sentence, I'm sorry, in the middle, which was that the koves can take 3 chutim and that's theirs, but more than that belongs to the balabait. But if they took 3 black chutim from a white garment, if they took more than 3 black chutim from a white garment, they can keep them all. The koveset, the launderer. Fine, sorry about that skip. And then it continues with, similar kind of conversation with a tailor, and then similar conversation with a carpenter, right? It's a question of how am I going to make sure that I don't steal? And to an extent, Bava Kama, in a way, is modeled after this concept of lo tigzol. What's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, and we are going to make sure that you don't take something that is yours. When you move to Bava Metzia, it's a different conversation. The conversation in Bava Metzia, and I want you to notice that Bava Kama basically ended with a conversation about clothing, also about, woodwork, but a conversation about clothing. I am laundering your clothing. What can I take or not take? And Bava Metzia opens with a conversation about clothing. But the conversation about clothing is not where clearly we know what's yours is yours and what's mine is mine, but it's actually contested property, right? Shnaim ochazin b'talit, 2 people are holding a garment. Zeh omer ni mitzatia, this one says I found it. Zeh omer ni mitzatia, this one says I found it. Zeh omer kula sheli, this is it's all mine. Zeh omer kula sheli, right? It's all mine, right? Bava Metzia says to us, sometimes it's not a question of I know what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, and make sure that there's no gezel, make sure there's no stealing. Sometimes the conversation is about contested ownership. And when there's contested ownership, what's going to happen is we split things, right? It doesn't always happen exactly that way, but contested ownership, we separate, right? Separate but equal, something like that. And it's interesting to see Bava Kama ends with clothing. We know what's yours, we know what's mine. Bava Metzia starts with clothing. We don't know what's yours, we don't know what's mine. This is contested. And you see that at the end of Bava Metzia as well, this sense of contesting of ownership of a possession where it's not clear whose it is. But instead of talking about clothing, what we're talking about is something that is on the land. Okay? you have two gardens, one is above the other, and you have a vegetable that's growing in between them. Is it contested, not clothing, but land. Rabbi Meir Omer Shel Elyon. Rabbi Meir says it belongs to the top one. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shel Tachton. Rabbi Yehuda says it belongs to the bottom one. Amar Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, well, Im Yirtzeh Elyon likach tafaro ein kan yerek. If the person with the garden on top decided to take away their soil, there would be no vegetable, right? And Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Im Yirtzeh Tachton lemalot et ginato ein kan yerek. And Rabbi Yehuda says, well, if the bottom one decided to fill up their whole gina with soil, there would be no yerek either. So Rabbi Meir says, okay, because they can both argue with each other, right? And argue with each other, meaning they can kind of, each one can cancel the other in one way or another. We're going to find where it's getting its nourishment from. But Rabbi Shimon says, Kol she'elyon yachol lifshot et yado v'litol harei hu shelo v'ashar shel hatachton. Wherever the elyon, the upper one, can reach and pull, the yerek belongs to that part of the yerek belongs, and the other one, the rest of it goes to the bottom one. Such a good parallel with the opening of Bava Metzia, right? Two people holding a garment, and here it's two people holding a yerek kilo, right? Like two people holding a vegetation. Again, contested ownership, splitting the ownership, right? Not a clear line, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, but the splitting of ownership. So we end Bava Metzia with land, and then guess where we go? We go to Bava Batra, where we're going to start with land. In Bava Batra, we're going to start with land, not land where it's clear what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, not land where it's contested and we're going to split it, but land where we have shared responsibility because we are shutafin, right? Shutafin, sheratzu la'asot mechita b'chatzer, the partners, right? Co-owners who want to make a partition or maybe want to make a split in their yard, bonin et hakol b'emtza, they're going to build a wall instead of each of them taking their part and walking away. Here it's the opposite, the shared responsibility. They each have to give. Whatever the proper medium is that you're supposed to use, the material that you're supposed to use is customary to use there, you use. Whatever the custom is. But notice, big veal, if you're making it out of a certain thing, non-chiseled stone, this side is going to give 3 hands breadths of their, of their side for the wall, and the other one's going to give 3 hand breadths for their side of the wall, and so on. If it's this other material, they're going to be 2 and 2, and if it's other material, 1.5, 1.5. But the point is, it's shared responsibility. They each give in. They don't divide, even though, of course, they're building a wall that divides them. But they're each giving in, shared responsibility. And I think that when you get to the end of Bava Batra, the Mishnah that we just looked at, right, it's another great example of shared responsibility. The Arev is a great example of shared responsibility. That's your shutaf in paying back your loan, right? But what does the Arev do? The Arev brings us back away, in some ways, brings us back away from land, right? Because we're going to go to dinei mamonot, even though land is included, but this big category of dinei mamonot, and that's going to become important in a second. But notice the whole focus here is what land are you allowed to collect from, right? So the beginning and the end of Batra is talking to us about shared responsibility and how land is impacted by shared responsibility, the importance of giving, not of splitting, but the important, meaning splitting and separating, but the importance of giving, right? So it's a beautiful thing. We have these 3 bavot that are all really part of one section that's telling us about where it's very clear, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, don't steal. The second, where it's much less clear, it's contested, and therefore we're going to split things. And the third is where we are sharing a responsibility. And so we are both on the hook in one way or another. Okay. And we move in these things from different kinds of possessions, right? Sometimes we're talking about clothing. Sometimes we're talking about landed space, right? But what we noted at the beginning is that what is always lurking in the background is the fact that A, we're talking about dinei mamonot writ large, but B, there is a possibility of violence, human to human. And I think it's intriguing to notice that Bava Batra ends with Dinei Mamonot, conversation about Dinei Mamonot. And what does Sanhedrin start with? Sanhedrin starts with the words Dinei Mamonot. Dinei Mamonot Bishlosha. Monetary law is adjudicated by 3 people. Gzelot v'chavalot bishlosha. Stealing and personal injury, go take us back to Bava Kama, with 3, nezek, chatzi nezek, tashlumi kefel, tashlumi arba'a v'chamisha, bishlosha, takes us back to Bava Kama. And now, here comes the violence against people. Ha'ones, v'hamefate, v'hamotzi shemra, right? Somebody who rapes a woman, somebody who seduces a woman, somebody who lies about a woman's virginity and falsely accuses her. 3 judges, Divrei Rabbi Meir, and then Chachamim say, by the way, Motzi Shemra, there could be even more violence. There's a possibility that if it turns out she really did commit adultery and it wasn't really Motzi Shemra, there's going to be a capital case here, right? So the beginning of Sanhedrin already says to us, we're not in Kansas anymore, right? Dinei Mamonot, that's one thing. We are on our way to some more intense things where maybe some of the Dinei Mamonot start to cross over to violence against people, but B, we may be starting to talk about Dinei Nefashot, right? We may be starting to talk about more severe infractions and more severe capital punishment, okay? And then the Mishnah and Sanhedrin at the end, of course, it goes back to the issue of a woman committing adultery, right? Which this Motzi Shemra piece had potentially within it. Mishnah Sanhedrin Yud Aleph Vav Hamid Nabeh B'Shem Avodah Zarah Ve'omer Kach Amra Avodah Zarah Afilu Kiven Et Halakha L'Tameh Et Tameh L'Teher Tahor. If somebody gives nevuah in the name of an Avodah Zarah, even if they say the proper halakha, it's still problematic. They're still going to get chenek. They're still going to get strangulation. Haba al eshet ish. Somebody who commits adultery with a woman, Kevan Shenichnas the Reshut Habal and Isuin. Once she has gone past the stage of erusin, Afal Pishaloni Vala, even though she hasn't had sex yet, she hasn't consummated the marriage yet. Habala Reza B'Chenek, you get chenek, you get strangulation. Zomamei Bat Kohen Bo'ala, Edim Zomamin on a Bat Kohen, even though she's supposed to get sreifa, and somebody who slept with her. Shakola Zomamin Makdimin Lo Tamita, Chutz Mizomamei Bat Kohen Bo'ala, they also get chenek, even though usually you would think that they would get what they were trying to give her, which would be sreifa. But suffice it to say, Mishnah Sanhedrin starts with the possibility of adultery. It ends with the possibility of adultery. Starts with the possibility of dinei nefashot. Ends with dinei nefashot, right? And the move from the Bavot to Mishnah Sanhedrin is that ending sentence of Rabbi Yishmael that dinei mamonot is the best, and you should learn from bananas. And then Sanhedrin starts with dinei mamonot and says, but we're going to expand the pool much more from there. We are going to be dealing with dinei nefashot. Again, not that you don't have dinei nefashot, you have a shore that is nogeach, right, in Bava Kama. But nonetheless, in terms of the way that things are framed. And I just want to say one more thing that I find interesting, and I'm not really sure what to do with, is I think it's interesting to notice that the ends of Bava, the last Mishnah of Bava Kama and the last Mishnah of Bava Mitzia have something linguistic in common, and the last Mishnah in Bava Batra and the last Mishnah in Sanhedrin have something in common. And again, I'm not sure what to do with it, but I just want to point it out because once I see it, I can't really unsee it. So last Mishnah in Bava Kama, remember, it's talking about a person who's a koves or a koveset, somebody who is a cleaner, or a soreket, somebody who's preparing a textile, who's notel, who takes out chutin, who takes out threads. And I just noticed the fact that at the end of Bamitzia, the conversation about, how do we figure out who this plant belongs to? It's, kol sha'elyon yachol lifshot et yado v'litol, as much as the person up top can reach their hand and litol, like notel, to take. So I'm not sure what to do with it. Could be totally happenstance, but I think it's interesting. I also think it's interesting that at the end of Bava Batra, we end with the possibility of somebody choking somebody else in the shuk. And of course, the whole last parak of Sanhedrin is Eluina Nechkin. It's all about chanika. It's all about strangulation. And certainly chenek is the topic of the last Mishnah, as we just read. So I'm not sure totally what to do with that. I think there's, there's something to be said for perhaps, we don't want people choking each other in the shuk, and therefore it's better to have a justice system that, even though it may have to do chenek sometimes, and it may have to strangle, but that's not like out of anger and lack of control, but it's actually a system. I'm not sure, but I wanted to bring it to learners' attention so that you can think about it. But suffice it to say, I think there is something magnificent here in terms of a superstructure. Again, lots of changes in between. And, Dr. Kirschenbaum yesterday pointed me to her father, Professor Dov Zlotnick's book, Pillar of Iron, about the formation of the Mishnah, because in the formation of the Mishnah, you do have things that come earlier, things that come later. So how would that impact trying to find a superstructure? And I think that's a really important and interesting question. And then you have the question of, okay, so you have these as the bookends, but how does the stuff in between work? So there's more work to do here, but at the very least, the bookends in Bava Kama tell us, lo tigzol, I know what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. You shouldn't take it if it's not yours. And if it damages mine and it's yours that damages mine, you're going to have to pay me and make me whole. Bava Metzia gives us the superstructure of contested property, where we are splitting and each going our own way. Doesn't mean it happens that way every single time. Doesn't mean there aren't other topics within, but that's the bookends. And Bava Batra, the bookends of shared responsibility. We are shutafin, or I am your arev. I don't know how you would say for a woman, maybe an areva, I think would make sense, right? But there's shutfut, the shared responsibility. And that shared responsibility means that it's mechayev people to bring in, right? Not to separate, but it's mechayev people to bring in, right? And all that sort of in, b'chad machta, sort of all that in one package leads us eventually to Sanhedrin, both because Sanhedrin is going to be meeting out the possibilities, the jurisdiction over these kinds of issues that we were talking about in the Bava, right? Like, where is this shtar going to be mikuyam? Where are we going to be figuring out how to be mechayev somebody nezek or chatzi nezek? Who's going to be deciding yachloku? They're going to split it. It's all going to be the Beit Din. But Sanhedrin very quickly tells us that if you thought that violence against people was lurking in potential in these other places, both we're going to deal with things of clear violence against people. We're going to end up dealing with murder, and we're also going to have a Beit Din that is capable of meting out violence against people, and not just charging them money when we get to Dinei Nefashot. So I hope wish everybody a mazel tov on their Siyum. I hope this superstructure sort of gives an interesting, even 60,000 feet, however it is, and wishing you all limud poreh, a really beautiful learning of Masechet Sanhedrin.